Okay, continuing on with our outstanding guest speaker series, today the TMCC Library Open Genealogy Lab is proud to welcome back Jonathan Dickey. Jonathan is a 13th generation descendant of one of the original shareholders in the Virginia Company, the London-based organization that obtained the first royal charter to establish a colony in the New World. The colony was named Jamestowne in honor of King James. Our speaker is honored to be a member of the Jamestowne Society and currently serves as Chief Historian for the Northern California Company of the Society. Jonathan also served as counselor for the Nevada and California Mayflower Societies. He's a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and a number of other heritage societies. Before his retirement in 2017, Jonathan was a practicing lawyer in Silicon Valley, representing many leading companies in the technology sector in complex litigation. His presentation today is called Tracing Your Virginia Ancestors, the Jamestowne Story. In 1606, the Virginia Company began its efforts to establish a new colony in North America, which was intended to create new opportunities for England to compete in the rapidly growing world of transatlantic trade. Over the next 2 decades, those efforts led to the creation of Jamestown and the establishment in 1619 of the very first democratic government in the New World. In these formative years, Jamestown in Virginia attracted many thousands of immigrants and scores of new towns and villages were settled. Despite its early hardships, which he will describe, Jamestown ultimately became a thriving center of trade and commerce. In today's talk, he will provide a history of Jamestown, an overview of the Jamestowne Society, and a detailed discussion on how to research your Jamestown and early Virginia ancestors. At the end of his talk today, he will take your questions, and he has also graciously agreed to make himself available for private consultations with anyone interested in joining the Jamestowne Society. So I'd like to offer a warm virtual welcome to Jonathan.
Thank you, Suzanne, and good morning to everybody. Thank you for participating today. It's a pleasure to be back. Some of you who are long-term attendees at the Genealogy Lab may remember I've done a couple of talks in the past. One was about the Pilgrims in their Leiden years, and also about the settlement of New Netherland. Both of those are near and dear to my heart because I have ancestors involved in all that. And the same is true here today for Jamestown. I am a member, as Suzanne said, of the Jamestowne Society. More recent, I might add, and my research and education on that subject is only getting started, but that having been said, it's been just a fascinating time to look into the Jamestowne story. As some of you may know, in addition to the Mayflower 400th anniversary this year, Jamestown celebrated its 400th anniversary in 2019, related, of course, to what Suzanne referred to as the first democratic government in the New World, which was established in 1619. I'll talk a little bit about that. You should have gotten 2 handouts in Suzanne's email to you all with the Zoom link. One is a chronology of sorts, and the second is some suggested readings. As we go along through this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about both of those subjects. Let me talk first about the Jamestowne Society before I get into some of the history. It has been around for almost 90 years. It is a national organization, of course, headquartered in Richmond, sort of the counterpart to the Plymouth headquarters for the Mayflower Society. We have chapters all over the country. We refer to them as companies. It's kind of interesting, the nomenclature that different societies use. Mayflower calls their chapters colonies. The Sons of the Union Veterans calls their chapters camps. Well, the Jamestowne Society calls them companies. And of course, in this case, it's because the original charter for the founding of Jamestown was granted to the Virginia Company, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We don't have a company here in Nevada. Our ranks are kind of thin, but we do have the opportunity here in Reno to belong to the Northern California Company, which is the company I belong to, and that's where I serve as their chief historian. You can, however, join any darn company that you want to if you were to become admitted here in in Nevada, you could join the Oregon company or what have you. So it's kind of a free-floating opportunity for new members to join any camp colony that they want. Of course, Northern California being the most proximate, that's the one logically that I joined. We do have back in Virginia a wealth of meetings and seminars and that sort of thing that go on throughout the year, at least when the COVID crisis has not been upon us. There is this amazing event in Washington, D.C. called Heritage Week, which is not limited to Jamestown. It is literally 2 weeks of every genealogical society you can think of in the land, meeting there in Washington, usually at the Army Navy Club, and hosting lunches and dinners and that sort of thing. So it's an amazing event, regardless of which society you belong to, it's worth attending. What's happening at Jamestowne today? Real briefly, I love this photograph, by the way. This is the fort at Jamestowne, just a fabulous image of it. There is also an amazing museum there. There was a talk from the curator at that museum just the other day. The museum is called The Vault, and it has way over 3 million artifacts there. It's a story of discovery which is ongoing. As we speak, a number of different archaeological digs are taking place there, and they continue to find a number of structures, other kinds of artifacts, graves, yes, that they're still unearthing. And the current project is to recreate the fort's barracks. That's a project that should be done by next year, and it will then be open for exhibition for people who actually make the trek to Jamestown. One interesting side note about the vault, when John Smith was the governor briefly of Jamestown, he had ordered the digging of a well to serve the fort and its people. And then a year or so later, they decided to abandon the fort and move upriver and filled in the well, along with quite a few artifacts that were buried in the well. So Jamestown archaeologists recently dug up what was in the well and found just a wealth of very interesting artifacts from all over the world, quite frankly. And when you think about that in comparison to Plymouth, where very little has been found, archaeologically speaking, Jamestown, which of course was founded much earlier than Plymouth, had quite a sophisticated town or fort that was running as early as 1608. And as I say, China and other things from all over the world, metalworks, have been found there in the well. A very curious thing they also found was the skeleton of a bird. And they actually performed quite a bit of archaeological work on the bird and discovered that there was only one place on Earth that this bird came from, which was the island of Bermuda. And a little bit later in this talk, I'll tell you why that's kind of interesting and the Bermuda connection to Jamestown. Okay, the Jamestown story. This is the briefest of chronologies that I could put on one page. I do recommend, if you're interested in sort of the blow by blow, I recommend my own written chronology that's in Suzanne's email, but also some other chronologies I'll mention a little bit later when we talk about how to do your research on your early Virginia ancestors. But you'll see here, I've just kind of encapsulated the period from 1606 to 1623, which is basically the time period that the Virginia Company actually controlled the colony. The first charter being granted in 1606, the Virginia Company's control basically ending in 1623 when the crown took over the colony for reasons that I'll talk about. First settlers in 1607. I'll talk about the starving time, which was the black mark on the Jamestown colony that most people are, somewhat familiar with, but I'll talk about that a little bit. 1619, I mentioned the first General Assembly. I forget how many people it was, but they gathered in July and August of 1619 to commence efforts to be a true democratic society. I'll talk about that. For slaves, I'll talk about that. That was in the same year, ironically, the first year of their democratic assembly was also the first year that enslaved persons came to Jamestown and Virginia. I'll talk about the really fun story about women first being recruited, so to speak, in 1620-21, the horrific massacre that occurred also in 1621, the tobacco monopoly that occurred, and as I say, then the loss of control by the Virginia Company. So what was going on before Jamestown? A very, very extended tug of war, quite frankly, between a number of European countries, England, Spain, and Holland in particular, all vying for the lucrative transatlantic trade, which was not limited to North America. Of course, the Spanish had already been very focused on planting colonies in South America, Central America, successfully so, extracting enormous amounts of minerals, gold, silver, and other precious metals. And that Spanish story really motivated England to catch up. England itself was experiencing a lot of widespread unemployment, soldiers returning from war who had no jobs and creating mischief in the streets of London. Lots of different negative factors conspiring to put England in a difficult place where it really needed to branch out, and creating colonies in the New World being perceived as one way to do that. The first step in that effort was Roanoke. Many of you know the Roanoke story, which has been dubbed the Lost Colony. Sir Walter Raleigh and others pressed Queen Elizabeth to engage in explorations and to fund explorations, seeking out places that would be appropriate to colonize, principally in order to generate trade products, agricultural products, timber, etc. And so in 1584, July, to be precise, the first English ships came to the New World. They discovered the Outer Banks and the island of Roanoke. There's a fascinating first-person account of that, which is in the written suggested readings that I prepared. Philip Amadas was a sailor. He actually led this particular expedition with a few others, and he published the first voyage to Roanoke. It's very colorful, it's very moving, and I encourage you to read it. It's a short read, but really puts you back in time to 1584, and you realize how scary and courageous it was to do what these folks did. The transatlantic voyage itself being a scary thing to do, but arriving in an unknown world and trying to plant a new colony. So it's fascinating reading. He was the person who named the area Virginia. And of course, it was in honor of Queen Elizabeth, who was a virgin. She never had children. She was, considered the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. So she did not take offense, quite honestly, when they named this area Virginia. Amadas and his crew returned to London, taking one of the sons of the chief of the Croatoan tribe. There were a number of different tribes. I don't know why he selected this particular son to take back, but the effort was then underway upon that return to London to proselytize and to promote the concept of developing colonies. Why was it called the Lost Colony? Well, most of you know this story that the colonists who were left behind disappeared. When they came back to Roanoke on the next voyage, they were nowhere to be found. To this day, nobody knows where those colonists went. There's some speculation. They've done archaeological work on the island, but here in 2020, we do not know the end of that story. You'll see here a map. The map was, as the legend here says, was done in 1585, so right after the first discovery of Roanoke. Let me see if I can do this with my pointer. Is my pointer showing up on the screen?
Yeah, we can see it.
So, here's the Atlantic. Here is Roanoke. That is the island. And as you proceed, this is actually going north. You proceed up the Outer Banks of Virginia Beach, Newport News, all of these modern towns are over here. I've actually got my images in the way. Let me get rid of this. Right. You go around the Horn here. So where is Jamestown? Jamestown is here. So this is the James River coming up here. At first, the fort was here at the mouth. It was moved upriver to about here. And as you'll see later on, this was the area of settlement extending up the James River and beyond. But this is where they first discovered land, which was Roanoke down here. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. What happened in the first couple of years? I call it the years of suffering and starvation. This is an etching that was done somewhat contemporaneously. These were the first ships, and they're building the first palisade, that is the fort. But it was hit or miss in terms of being able to find the resources, food, other supplies to sustain the colony. And you'll see here they walked right into a severe drought, which would have been bad in and of itself. However, then as soon as they finished constructing the fort, most of it burned down. So disaster number one takes place right off the bat in 1608, partly because of some poor governance. John Smith takes over as the governor. He leaves in 1609 and is quickly replaced by his successor, George Percy, who, for reasons I'll explain, became just a holy terror in the settlement. And on top of all of that, tensions with the local tribes were increasing. And although we like to think with the Pocahontas story, which I'll talk about, that peace had kind of broken out, well, it hadn't, at least as of 1609. And a number of the tribes effectively had Jamestown under siege as we enter 1609 and what's been called the Starving Time. The Starving Time was, as the name implied, truly a moment when this colony, for all intents and purposes, had failed. Its people were starving. The Indians, the tribes, had been the primary source of food for the settlement. One of the things John Smith, before he went back to England, had been instrumental in is having good enough relations with the tribes to have them supply food. Now he's gone. The Indians do not like Governor Percy at all, and they commence a number of different attacks. The combination of these attacks and literal starvation, you'll see here, just the horrible story is 2 out of 3 settlers died during the starving time. And they were not getting any supplies. There were supposed to be supply ships coming. They didn't show up. Why did they not show up? Well, they ran into a hurricane. And I forget how many supply ships it was in the group of ships that were being sent, but most of them scattered to the winds. 3 of them survived long enough to be shipwrecked on what is now Bermuda. They didn't know what it was. It was an unknown island, but that's where they were shipwrecked. And interestingly, for those of you who are Mayflower members or interested in that whole story, Stephen Hopkins, a Mayflower passenger, was among the shipwrecked crew and actually was quite a tempest himself, creating mischief among the shipwrecked crew members to the point that he was going to be hanged. And he talked his way out of, literally he had the noose around his neck. He talked his way out of it long enough to help construct, or I should say, restore one of the ships that would take them to Jamestown. They were successful in doing that. And he found his way, along with the other crew members, to Jamestown. I have here in parentheticals, read Shakespeare's The Tempest. The Tempest was actually based upon the shipwreck of these ships bound for Jamestown. And while The Tempest is kind of a romance, it's based upon the true story of this horrible event, which included a tyrannical ship's captain on the island who really tortured and oppressed the crew members before they were able to get off the island and make it to Jamestown. When they arrive in Jamestown, the settlers are starving. The settlers were about to abandon the fort and try to return to England or to go upriver, one of the two. But when these ships arrived just in the nick of time, they stayed put, and the settlement was in a shambles. And the crew members who arrived were instrumental in getting the fort back on its feet. They rebuilt the fort, made it stronger because there had been these Indian attacks, et cetera, et cetera. So by the end of 1610, the ship was, so to speak, was being righted, but by that point, only 60 colonists out of hundreds were still alive. So the starving time, a horrible moment in the Jamestown story. We've all heard about the issue of cannibalism. I have it with a question mark because for many, many decades, a number of historians and others were not convinced that there actually had been cannibalism. Well, the discovery of the skeleton of Jane, who you see depicted here, that's a skull on the left. That's a rendering of what she might have looked like, done by people who can do facial reconstruction. When they discovered Jane, there was no question that there had been cannibalism. You'll see on the skull those 3 lines at the top of the skull. Well, those are butcher's knives marks, where they were able to determine poor Jane had been killed. They had scraped the flesh off of her head, her cheeks, and her tongue, and then they had made holes where they could extract her brain. So that was, a pretty awful discovery, but it at least punctuates the point I was making, that the couple of years of 1609, 1610, the starving time, were truly disastrous, and it continued. It continued under the new governor, George Percy, who took control in 1609, and he was a tyrant of tyrants. He tortured. He executed people for insubordination. There was a aura of Jamestown being a prison camp for all intents and purposes, and rebellious colonists were threatening to oust Percy or worse. So that period of time really almost killed the colony. It turned around in 1610, late 1610 and 1611, hundreds of new settlers arrived, bringing provisions, bringing people with skills, artisans and otherwise. They began to build a true colony. Relations with the Indians are still touch and go, still tense. 1612, Pocahontas is captured. We all know Pocahontas. She was captured and held at Jamestown. I'll get to her full story in a minute. Efforts were then underway to search for gold and other materials. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons the colony was even theorized or thought about was to find trade products, trade materials. And the effort was underway. At this point, it wasn't tobacco. It was gold, it was minerals, it was timber, it was raw materials to ship back to England. Tobacco came later. Also ongoing were efforts to build more infrastructure. The archaeologists have dug up, scores and scores of examples of glass making, tool making, masonry, leaden work, et cetera, et cetera. They actually had some Venetian glass makers show up on one of the ships, and they took over starting a glass making business, which apparently was thriving because they've found many, many, many artifacts suggesting that they were very successful in making, manufacturing, distributing glass all over the colony and up the James River and so forth. Things were looking so good that by 1619, that year that the Jamestown descendants celebrate, there was what we all think of as the real first Thanksgiving, which took place at the Berkeley Plantation, which was upriver. And while it wasn't, with turkey and Indians, it was a moment where people gathered, they gave thanks to the Lord, there were prayers said, and in retrospect, truly a Thanksgiving event for Jamestown. Quickly, the Pocahontas story, you'll see her here in this etching. This was taken when Pocahontas went back to London with her husband, John Rolfe. You'll see in my timeline there, she and John married in 1614, ended up going back to London in 1616. They found the church where Pocahontas and John Rolfe were married. They've found it, they've excavated it, and if you go to Jamestown, you can see it and walk through it. She was obviously an interesting player in the history of Jamestown. That's why we remember her 400 years later. There's a lot of myth about her. There's myth about her and John Smith. A lot of historians heretofore have likened it to the romantic relationship between Priscilla Mullins and John Alden and Miles Standish and so forth. Well, I think modern historians don't view Pocahontas and John Smith as being an item. It is true that John Smith did meet Pocahontas in her tribal village. As I mentioned earlier, he was involved in getting food from the tribes, and that's on one occasion, that's where he met her many times, actually. She was the daughter of the chief of the Powhatan tribe, which was the biggest and most important of the tribes. You'll see here these astounding numbers. That tribe controlled 8,000 square miles and 15,000 people were part of that trial. So it was a major tribe, and she was a major princess, basically. She ultimately was captured in a moment of conflict between the colonists and the Powhatans. Powhatans having been part of the earlier attacks back in 1608-09. She was captured and held for a year. And then interestingly, she converted to Christianity, changed her name. I don't know why it was Rebecca, but she changed her name to Rebecca, and then promptly married John Rolfe. And the rest was sort of history. She died in London on that visit of her and her husband in that period, 1616, 17. But before she did, she became sort of the personification of the Jamestown Native American story. Rolfe had gone to London in order to tell a very positive story about Jamestown with the goal of recruiting more settlers to come. And by all accounts, very successful in doing so. And she was kind of the toast of the town until she passed away in 1616, 17. John Smith, real briefly, he was a soldier. You could liken him to Miles Standish. He was very busy as a soldier before he came to the New World. He was a tough guy. He came in one of the very first, he came in that first wave of ships in 1607. Because he had a propensity to violence, I gather, and it's been documented, he committed some acts on the ship that caused the captain to arrest him and imprison him literally on the ship. Also on the ship was a sealed envelope that could only be opened when they arrived, which was going to announce who the new leaders of the Jamestown colony, or the first leaders of the Jamestown colony, were going to be. So when he arrives as a prisoner, they open the envelope and it says that John Smith is going to be one of the leaders. So they had to let him go so that he could move on to be a member of the governing council. As I said, he led the efforts to get food and other supplies. He had a great relationship, supposedly, or apparently, with the chief of the Powhatans. He gets captured, momentarily released. He comes back, he becomes president of the council, and he's disenchanted with the colonists who don't follow his orders, basically. And he leaves in a huff, returns to England, and dies a couple of decades later. We all know, I think, that, besides the Jamestown John Smith, he was a Plymouth John Smith. He was very instrumental in mapping and doing early explorations of what's now Massachusetts. Did amazing maps that our Plymouth ancestors, our Mayflower ancestors actually used when they came to the New World to try to find out where they were going. And of course, they were supposed to be going to the northern end of the Virginia Company's charter. They had been funded by the Virginia Company. And they went off course and they ended up in Plymouth, but for all intents and purposes, they were supposed to be part of the same charter as those who founded Jamestown. So talk about going off course. 1619, I've said, it's the first democratic government. It was the General Assembly in mid-1619 that we're talking about, and it was there to establish, it was formed to establish, quote, one equal and uniform government. There were 4 councilors, there was a governor, there were 22 burgesses. When we talk about researching your ancestors, it may be there are, hundreds of thousands of people who are descendants of the burgesses, and you might be one of them. We'll talk about that. But they were all chosen amongst the free white inhabitants, not the slaves, not the indentured inhabitants, but the free white inhabitants, to form the General Assembly. They found the wooden church, which was where they first met. That has been excavated. And again, if you go to Jamestown, you can walk through it. Apparently, the General Assembly continues to meet today. So it's been 400 years of continuous meetings of the General Assembly since 1619. The Great Reforms is a label that's been put on what that General Assembly did. And it consisted of a lot of different reforms, but principally it was about land. And I'm just reading from a list of the things that were in the Great Charter of 1619. They basically, first of all, granted land distributions to all of the ancient planters. These were people who had been there before 1616. They were about to have a lot of newcomers from England coming to the colony. So one of the great reforms is to figure out how to allocate land to these newcomers. Then there were reforms about protecting land, protecting private property, and then the orderly settlement along the James River of new towns. So you can tell from that list that a major theme of the colony in 1619 was expansion and land grants and expanding the agricultural base and other trade products along with it. And of course, somewhat like the New England settlers, everybody wanted land and more land. So part of the great reforms was to bring some order to that otherwise chaotic system that had been in place. 1619 was the same year, as I mentioned, as the first African slaves. It was sort of accidental that they were there. They were bound for Veracruz, along with 350 other enslaved Africans who had been captured in Angola on a Portuguese ship. That ship was marauded by two English ships, English privateers, and the English privateers took a cargo of about 20 of those slaves and brought them to Jamestown. And so that was the first event in the story of enslavement at Jamestown. There were about 23, as I said, in 1619. There was a census in 1620 that showed 32 slaves at that point. And then a few years later, in part because of the Indian attacks I'll talk about in a second, the number actually declined to 23 in 1625. You'll see my reference to Angela. Angela is one of the slaves, the only of these original slaves that had a name in the census. She had been enslaved and owned by Captain William Pierce, who had a plantation upriver. The photograph you see here is of some current ongoing archaeological digs at the William Pierce plantation. It's now called the Ambler Mansion. There is a mansion on the site. And it's part of what's called the First African Project, which has been going on for several years. The goal is to discover as much as is possible archaeologically that would help us today understand the enslavement story in Jamestown. A lot of our artifacts have been discovered, some of clear, African design. So we know that this spot that you're looking at was in fact populated by slaves. And we know that this was the plantation where Angela, named in the census, worked for her owner, William Pierce. The next year, 1620, I said there was an amusing story about women. Most of the colony inhabitants in 1620 were men, and very precious few women to go around to be wives and mothers. And so in 1620 in London, they made a very conscious and deliberate effort to market Jamestown to women who could potentially go to Jamestown, marry, and become wives and mothers. You'll see this quote here from Lord Bacon, which is, I would say, amusing. When a plantation grows to strength, then it is time to plant with women. as well as with men, that the plantation may spread into generations and may not be ever pieced from without. Wonderful quote. So the goal was, and they achieved the goals, to find 100 women who would come to Jamestown and marry, and that did happen. Some of you may know there's a kind of a silly television series on cable called Jamestowne, and it's all about this story of the 100 women who were shipped to Jamestown to marry. It was not without controversy. There were a number of leaders back in London and elsewhere who really thought that it was a mistake to have women in the colony, that they were going to disrupt and interfere with the effort to develop trade and so forth. And this quote here is kind of sexist. Men, I say, can live without women, but women cannot live without men. Everybody got past that point of view, and the women came, and the colony then grew in the right way. Families were created, and generations were then to come. More expansion in the 1620s and 30s. I'm going to quickly cover all of this. Probably the worst development, though, was in 1622. Massive Indian attack killed hundreds and hundreds of men, women, and children. It was hard for the colony to recover from that, but it certainly attempted to do so. Partly because of that, this is when the Virginia Company lost its charter in 1623, and the Crown, that is the government back in London, took over. And from that point on, things settled down, new settlements and plantations. They moved the center of government to the nearby Middle Plantation, that's now Williamsburg. Jamestown itself started to recede as the center of anything, quite frankly. And the General Assembly was finally recognized in 1637. But the massacre really was not just a catastrophic event for those who were there in Jamestown. It became a bone of contention back in London. You'll see this pamphlet here, which talks about the barbarous massacre in 1622. Lots of efforts were then made to strengthen the defenses of the colony, it being anticipated that relations with the tribes were now at an end, and that the colony could expect more and more violent encounters and confrontations. You'll see here that in 1623, after the massacre and all the deaths, they created a list of the living and dead. It has an asterisk there because we can actually look at that list today. It's on the Jamestown website. I'll come to that in a few minutes. And they created an army, a muster being the list of soldiers who would then defend the colony. And the muster was created in the period 1624-25. And that too exists, and we can find it on the Jamestown website. So I talked about getting out of town, and you'll see here a map that shows precisely how the original colonists abandoned the original Jamestown fort and town and moved upriver. And all of these black circles that you see here are new colony, towns going upriver. And there's a legend here of all of those towns, by the date that they were founded. And you can see how many of them now existed by 1619. Many of you who are researching your ancestors, they may have found their way to one or more of these towns as they continued to move upriver and west. So that's probably a good segue to, okay, how best to research your Virginia ancestors, and along with that, how does this relate to the Jamestown Society? First, on that, here's a quick thumbnail of what you need to prove to be eligible for membership. All of this is on the Jamestown website, so I'm not going to repeat it all here in this presentation. But the main point being, you need to trace either to somebody who was there, or, and I think this is an important point to emphasize, you can be a Jamestown descendant from somebody who never even touched ground in Jamestown or Virginia. That would be my own case. My ancestor, as Suzanne said in her introduction of me, my ancestor was a shareholder in the Virginia company back in London. He was basically an investor. And there were hundreds and hundreds of such investors in London, all of whom are qualifying ancestors for purposes of attempting to join the Jamestown Society. So I encourage you to look on the website for all of those names, and I'll show you how to do that at the end of this presentation. The application process, as I just mentioned, it starts with, you got to find a qualifying ancestor. At this point, after the Jamestown Society has been in business for almost 90 years, society has a pretty darn good understanding of who was there or who was in the London company who would be a qualifying ancestor. That's not to say that new people aren't discovered. They are. And if you look on the website, every once in a while, it'll say, new qualifying ancestor. And then by the same token, sometimes qualifying ancestors are dropped when it's discovered that there's some flaw in the original research on who these people were and what they were doing or not doing, as the case may be, in Jamestown or with the London company. One way to try to shorten your research would be to find approved applications that have already been vetted by Jamestown and basically piggyback off of those. That's not dissimilar to what you can do with the Mayflower Society, where lots and lots of approved applications are used to find several of your generations already approved, and you don't need to reinvent that wheel. You can get those applications from Jamestown for the low price of $38 each, and it will speed the process along. All of this gets reviewed in Richmond, Virginia by the registrar there. You can get some help locally from whatever company is closest to you. And in my case, Larry Wynn in Northern California served as my kind of initial sanity check guy in seeing if my line to a Jamestown ancestor was valid. And he has a prodigious knowledge of all this stuff. He also happens to have a large repository of the key books that are typically relied upon to prove up someone's ancestry. In my own case, one of the first stops I made on my research journey was to look at the so-called charter documents that were created back in the day, 3 of them in 1606, 1609, 1612, in which, for example, in my case, my ancestor invested in the Virginia company, and he is then listed in a charter document. And there are long lists of people who did that. The charter documents also have a long list of, I'll call them guilds, companies of certain kinds of trade people back in London. So there'll be a company of grocers, for example. I mention that one because I have another Jamestown ancestor who back in London was part of the grocery guild And his guild invested in the Virginia Company, which made him a qualifying ancestor for purposes of joining the Jamestowne Society. So even if you look at the charter documents and you don't find an individual name or surname that is in your line, it may be that you have somebody who was a participant in one or more of those guilds back in London. So that's a little bit more intense research to do, but it can be done, and you can identify the people who were in the guilds at any given time for these purposes. One of the other really useful things to consult, and this is on the Jamestowne website. If we get time at the end of this, I'll show you where. There is a list of people that Jamestowne Society compiled who lived during the Revolutionary War era, late 1700s, not early 1600s, but who themselves trace to a Jamestown ancestor, usually because there's been another descendant who has made that proof using a Revolutionary War ancestor and then proving up the remaining generations from the late 1700s to a Jamestown ancestor. Well, the Jamestowne Society has compiled all this. It's compiled by the name of the person who lived during the Revolution. It shows the person, the qualifying ancestor to whom that person traces, and then the number for that ancestor by approved application. So in my case, let's say I have 3 people who are Revolutionary War era people. They all trace to the same qualifying ancestor. I can order the approved applications that relate to all 3 of those Revolutionary War ancestors. I can get them in hand and I can look and see what the proofs were for those people. And then I just recycle them and use them for my own application. I'll give you an example of that when we get here to the end of the talk. Suzanne, how am I doing time-wise?
You're doing great.
Okay, good. Then also, there is a register. This is basically where you get your qualifying ancestors. The Jamestown Register of Qualifying 17th Century Ancestors. There's a book that's available to purchase from their website. This is basically an add-on to the qualifying ancestor list that's on the website. So this one you have to buy. It's not publicly available, but it's worth the $13 to get it if you don't already know who your qualifying ancestor is. I mean, there's 2 ways that people approach this. One is they know who their QA is and they're working their way down, or they don't know who their QA is and they're working their way up. This book would be helpful for the latter, which is you don't really know how you're going to get back to the early 1600s. The Bible, so to speak, is what I've referred to here as The Adventures of Purse and Person. It's a 3-volume tome, and Mr. Dorman has always been viewed as the leading scholar on who was at Jamestown, who were investors, et cetera, et cetera. That's the purse part of it. So if, in my case, I trace to John Vassall, an investor in the London company, that's the purse part of it. If you can find your people in his book, you're golden, because nobody will question the authority of his research and what's published in his book. The same is true for Martha McCarthy's book, which I've listed out here. I actually have it on my bookshelf. It's about 5 inches of person by person listings of Virginia immigrants with the proviso that it stops at 1635. So if you have somebody who was in Virginia in 1636, it's not going to show up in this book, but it's considered to be very authoritative. Lastly, I've put on here something I referred to either the lists of the living and the dead. This is not a new book. It was generated, it was written in 1623, and it will basically tell you whether you had an ancestor who was alive in 1623 or who was killed in the Indian Massacre in 1622 or died in the starving time or what have you. So it's a very important list. I think that's why it's on the Jamestowne Society website. I alluded earlier that as the settlements started to go upriver on the James River, well, they kept going. And so many original Virginia settlers, Jamestown and these nearby towns, they kept going, and they ended up founding either plantations or towns or both in what's now North Carolina, Kentucky, Maryland, other places where they came to rest, or they even kept going from there. I have one friend who's applying for membership, and I've been working with her on her application. Well, her line went from the Jamestown Fort to Charles City, which was upriver, to North Carolina, although North Carolina didn't exist then, but what's now North Carolina, to Kentucky. So you can kind of see it's kind of going along this slide. North Carolina to Kentucky, to Missouri, to Omaha, to California, to Reno. So it's been a long, long, migration, but that was not untypical because, as I emphasized earlier, a lot of this was about land. It was about acquiring enough land to have your own plantation, perhaps, hundreds of acres to thousands of acres to tens of thousands of acres in some cases. But some of the early grants to the early immigrants were at least 100 acres, but from their standpoint, not enough. So I strongly encourage you in your research, look perhaps at that migration pattern. You may find lots of information in the state census of North Carolina. You may find Kentucky wills, probate records. I've found both of those in my own research for this person I'm working with. And then lastly on this slide, as I said, a lot of people never touched ground in Virginia. They may not have ever even come to the New World, but they may also have been in New England. And I have examples of that in my own family, where the investor in the Virginia company didn't go to Virginia, but went to Massachusetts. And so the research and the genealogy on that person is focused on Massachusetts, not Virginia. So there's lots of different venues to consider as you're trying to document and gather the proofs for your line. This is my last slide, a couple of quick research tools here, and hopefully with Suzanne's help, I'm going to figure out how to do this. Besides the Jamestowne Society website, well, it has a very, very long list of reading resources, too long to even possibly try to summarize here. Has a lot of online texts that will help you in your research. This is all on the public site, not members only. There's an organization I referred to at the outset of this talk called Jamestown Rediscovery. They have a fantastic website. I actually think it's way better than the Jamestown Society's website. I think it's better than the Mayflower Society website. Lots of fun stuff, but it has a very helpful genealogy tab that lists lots of books and resources that you could consult. You can see the website address here, historicjamestown.org. There's also a number of different chronologies that you can consult, including one on the Jamestown Society website, but also on Jamestown Rediscovery's website. What do you see?
We see the Jamestown Rediscovery website.
Great. Okay. So this is not the Jamestown Society. Jamestown Rediscovery does most of the legwork, the on-the-ground work at Jamestown, sponsoring the archaeological digs, doing lots of videos and educational materials about Jamestown and related topics. And you can see here, there's a tab on archaeology, which has, let me just, maps. If you wanted to look at the current archaeological finds that exist at the site, I mentioned the barracks, for example. That's the doors 27. So here's the barracks. That's what they're working on right now, to basically recreate the barracks that were in the original fort. You can see the outlines of the fort there. And so all of this was within the walls of the fort. And they're also, of course, doing archaeological work upriver and all over the place. On the history tab right here, so here's your genealogy tab, researching historical figures and family roots. So that's a good place to go. And here they go down, here's person, the book I mentioned. It's pricey. You can see there it's $100-something bucks. So that's probably not one the average person wants to get, but here's some others that are more affordable, and you just kind of go down the line. Here's first settlers of Jamestown in 1607. That's $3. So that's an affordable one. Here's another one that's a good one. And then the book I was mentioning from McCarthy, here, Virginia Immigrants and Adventurers. That's a $60 tome, but lots of information. Anybody, by the way, who wants to shoot me, not on chat, but an email, and Suzanne will give it to you, saying, could you look up so-and-so in your book? I'd be happy to do that. And again, this is only for people up to 1635. But if you think you got one of those, I'd be happy to look in the book, copy the page where your person is referenced, and send it to you.
And Jonathan, I'd like to just kind of inject something right here. Quite a few of the books that you just showed us on this webpage are the TMCC Library has. So not all of them, obviously, but quite a few that I just saw you scroll through, we do have in our genealogy book collection.
That we can't get to.
Yeah, well, nobody, yeah, because of the virus. But as soon as the library opens back up again, definitely books are available.
Or, I don't know, Suzanne, if you would do this, if somebody says, would you look at this in this book, and next time you're on campus, maybe you'd want to do that. Anyway, so then that's the genealogy thing. The historic timeline, I think, is really fun. So here's where you are, right? And it has this thing that goes year by year, and you'd say, well, that ain't such a much, but let's click on 1607. Look what it does. Incredible detail, month by month, of what was going on at Jamestown in 1607. I found it, I mean, it's very user-friendly. I found it to just be really fun, really informative, and you don't have to buy, a $100 book to see a lot of detail year by year. So that's just 1 year, that's 1607. You can go to 1619, that very important year, and you'll see all kinds of details. Here's the General Assembly, composed of elected representatives, and here's the church at Jamestown. You click on that, it'll take you to the history of the church. So very interactive, very informative. It has some profiles if you want to here's something about Pocahontas. So if you want a little blurb about Pocahontas, they just, picked her because she's popular. Tells a little story about her. They do it on John Smith, John Rolfe, that's Pocahontas's husband. Here's Pocahontas's father, Chief Powhatan, etc. So I recommend this site to people who really kind of want to dig in on this. Let's take you to the Jamestowne site. Okay, we're at the Jamestowne site, the society site, that is. So I mentioned a few things that would be resources. Under resources, you'll see, first of all, this incredibly detailed chronology. Again, year by year, month by month, day by day. It just goes for pages and pages. So that's probably more information than most people want. Here are the charters I mentioned. You can click down here to the 1606 charter. And there it is. Now, one problem with what they've done, so this takes you to Yale Law School. I went to Michigan Law School, so I won't comment. But you'll see here as you scroll down, look at all these names that are in here in tiny type. But so that's not a great way to read it. What I would recommend is you go to archive.org. Many of you are familiar with that. And it has this in a much more readable way. Here's this list. I'm circling it here. It's tiny type. It's almost impossible to read. But if I wanted to, I could find my guy, John Vassall, somewhere in this list. And now down here at the bottom, let me know if you can see my cursor, but at the very bottom, it has this list of all these trade guilds: the Company of White Bakers, the Company of Wax Candlers, the Company of Tallow Chandlers, the Company of Armorers, etc. So to repeat, you may have somebody who's in one of these guilds that is only referenced here by the name of the guild, but that person would qualify as a Jamestowne ancestor. Is that making sense? Yes.
And Jonathan, I did put your email address directly in the chat box for everyone.
Okay, perfect. I got about 5 minutes left. So I mentioned the lists of the living and the dead. Kind of a morbid thing at some level, but here it is. So this would tell you who was living and dead in 1623 and those who were massacred, sadly. And it goes right down this list, and you can see all of these names by location. So when the Indians attacked, let me go down to that section. It's at the very end. Well, I can't see the line of demarcation, but it will break it all down by town or location. So here, this was a very famous place, Martin's 100. Basically, that was a plantation that Mr. Martin had, and he was kind of a wheeler dealer in early Jamestown. But these were all people who were at that location. And you can see here, John Pattison killed, Uxor Pattison killed. I don't know what Uxor means, but so you can go right down these long lists and try to find an ancestral name there, okay? Then qualifying ancestors, if you go to that tab under membership, it goes alphabetically. I'll just pick on the main one here, okay? 17th century qualifying ancestors. And you remember I mentioned the muster. So first of all, here's the 1624-25 muster. One way you become a member is to show that you have a person who was on that muster. So let's click on that. And that takes you to this website, Virtual Jamestown. And then you go down 6 different databases here where you might have an ancestor who was part of the 1624-25 muster, okay? Then scroll down further. Here's the list of all the names of qualifying ancestors. So if I wanted to go to my guy, John Vassell, let's scroll down here to V. Come on. Oops, went right past the V's. All right, John Vassell, that's my guy. I click on him and it'll give me this information about him up at the top. This first thing is his qualifying ancestor number. So he's an A9471, and anything about Vassell, that's what you refer to him as. Here's his birth and death dates, and here's where he came from, and then it says Virginia Company stockholder. You look at all these other names under W. Here was a Burgess, here was a counselor, another Burgess. Look at all these Burgesses. So you can go through those names alphabetically. Then I mentioned this thing about the Revolutionary War. So let me come back to the top here. So under membership, qualifying ancestors, you scroll over and down. Here's added and dropped. I mentioned that. Here's the one that you might hit pay dirt with, Revolutionary War era people. And you come down here. It so happens that my guy is the very first person on this list. And it tells me that my ancestor, Thomas Abbey, who married Penelope Terry, is a descendant of John Vassell. And in fact, when I applied for membership, I already knew I was a descendant, and I'd already proven that I was a descendant of Thomas Abbey. So now all I needed to do is order this application, and I'm there. I basically have shorthanded the whole darn thing because I can find in this column, alphabetical, a Revolutionary War ancestor of mine who traces to a qualifying ancestor. Hopefully that makes sense. What else can I show you on the website? So I've gone through the resources, I've gone through the membership stuff. I'll just quickly do added and drop. So I'm not sure how often they update, but this should be showing. It's not showing any. If I go to home, there's a lot of good content, by the way, on the home page. Here's that map I showed you, by the way. And if you come down here to this corner, it says new qualified ancestors, and it gives a list, okay? So why is this important? I'll end on this note. Don't give up if you can't find an ancestor on their published list of qualifying ancestor. You may be able, like these people did, to prove up a new qualified ancestor. So again, don't give up. With that, I'm happy to talk to anybody afterwards. You've got my email from Suzanne on the chat. And I'm open for business if you'd like to consult with me. We'd love to have some new members in the Jamestowne Society here in Nevada. There's a whopping 12 of us statewide, so we'd love to have a few more. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, Jonathan, that was great. I learned an awful lot. I'm going to be definitely going to the website to see if my Revolutionary War ancestors are listed there. Now, Bill out in the audience looked up Uxor, and he says that it's Latin, he thinks, for wife.
Okay, that would make sense.
And let's see here, hold on. Looks like the other questions are regarding the YouTube questions. Oh, by the way, for the audience, Jonathan has graciously allowed us to videotape today's presentation. So it'll take probably a couple weeks to get it posted onto our YouTube channel. But it's easy to get to the YouTube channel. All you do is go to YouTube, type in TMCC, which stands for Truckee Meadows Community College. Once the TMCC YouTube channel comes up, click on playlist, and then click genealogy off the playlist, and that'll take you right to a listing of all of our recordings, including some of Jonathan's past presentations. And Jonathan, did you want to go ahead and do a plug for your upcoming one?
Oh, yeah. Actually, let me get, am I on camera?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just pulling up the date here. February 19, seems like a million years from now. February 19, I'll be giving a talk in the Genealogy Lab on the subject of medieval genealogy. What is that? It's trying to trace your ancestral lines to the 1500s, the 1000s, or earlier, which I happen to have done and have been privileged to be a member of a lot of different medieval heritage societies. So I'm going to be talking about that and how to find your roots through the various and sundry means that might get you to people like Charlemagne. I'm told, by the way, that there's probably 100 million people on Earth who are descendants of Charlemagne. It's kind of like on the Mayflower Society, one guy, John Howland, has 10 million descendants living today. So don't be surprised. You might have a medieval ancestor, and I'd be happy to help on that one too. But February 19, give it a listen.
And also I wanted to put a plug in once again for our wonderful genealogy book collection at the TMCC Library. We also have several books on the descendants of Charlemagne as well. April posted to everybody, both of the websites you showed us are fantastic. I don't know if I have ancestors in this group, but can't wait to look. Very interesting and informative presentation. Thank you. And, that's the one thing I can say, Jonathan, I don't really have a lot of questions because you just really covered everything really, really well. I mean, your information was spot on and just step by step walked us through it wonderfully. So I'll ask the class if you have anything. Oh, here's the one. Jan says, thanks. Doing a quick search on the living and the dead list. 2 of my surnames are included. So it looks to me, Jonathan, like you're going to have some new members.
There you go. I'm happy to help, like I said.
And to the class, once again, I put Jonathan's email address into the chat box. And if you want to download that chat box, just go to the chat box and click on the 3 little dots in the lower right-hand corner. And that will download the entire chat box onto your computer. So you have everything that Jonathan went over. Let's see here, Connie just posted extremely detailed. I'm sure I'll find someone I'm related to. Thank you very much. And,
You're welcome.
So I'll give the class just a few more moments to post any questions you might have in the chat box. Okay, Nettie says that she can't find the dots. Oh, you're on an iPad, Nettie. I think it's slightly different on the iPad. Just look around. There should be. I'm on a computer right now. I'm not on an iPad, but I do know the iPad display is slightly different than a computer display. Look around. There should be an indication about how to download that. Let's see here. If anyone's on an iPad right now out in the audience, if you could post how you download the chat box in the iPad.
Hey, Suzanne, it just occurred to me, I should mention, I think you're going to do this, but I put a lot of content in my slide deck. I'm happy to have that slide deck made available to your participants.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, if you can email it to me, I'll go ahead and include it in the when I send out the links, probably in the next week or so, and with the link to your recording of your webinar.
Great.
So, okay, well, it doesn't look like anyone has any questions. So before I stop the recording, I want to let everyone know the second hour of class is working on our trees, either individually or in groups. And with that, Jonathan, I'm going to say thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, as always.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me back. And thanks everybody for listening. Take care.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording.